Good morning and welcome to the second and final week of our course, Kuniyoshi and Kunisada. My name is Kristen Hoskins and I'm the curator of lectures, courses, and concerts. Today's lecture is Showdown, the Conservator's View, presented by Joan Wright, the Bettina Burr Conservator. With close to 30 years' experience as a museum conservator, specializing in works of art on paper, Joan Wright received her master's and certificate in conservation, specializing in works of art on paper, from the SUNY Cooperstown Buffalo Graduate Program in the Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works in 1984. From 1998 onward, as a member of the Asian Conservation Studio staff, she has concentrated on Asian works on paper. She was responsible for the care of Indian and Islamic paintings, manuscripts, Japanese woodblock prints, illustrated books, and Japanese postcards. An MFA career highlight was the design and implementation of a major project to image, catalog, survey, and rehouse the museum's renowned collection of over 50,000 Japanese woodblock prints and illustrated books, which you will hear much more about in this lecture. In recognition of her contributions to the field, Joan was elected as a member of the Print Council of America, a professional organization of print specialists with a current membership of over 200 individuals, comprised primarily of museum curators, but also including university professors, conservators of works on paper, and independent scholars with a strong commitment to the study of prints. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and please join me in welcoming Joan Wright.
Thank you, Kristen, and welcome to everybody here today. As a member of the museum's Asian Conservation Studio staff, I'm pleased to talk about our work with the Japanese print collection and the selection of prints that are on display today in Showdown, Kuniyoshi versus Kunisada. Hopefully, today's presentation will give you insight into the work of a museum conservator, encourage you to view the prints with an eye attuned to their technical skill, and inspire an enthusiasm for the world of printmaking that you will want to share with others. And without further ado, let's get going. Dr. William Sturgis Bigelow's gift to the MFA in 1911 of about 33,000 Japanese prints represents the core of the total print collection of over 52,000 images, ranging in date from the Nara period to works by contemporary artists. The majority of Dr. Bigelow's collection was purchased during his travels in Japan from 1882 through 1889. Shortly after his return to Boston, and in anticipation of his gift of prints, he wrote to the director of the Museum of Fine Arts, "I think the MFA has now got a series of prints that illustrate pretty much all that is worth illustrating in the history of block printing in Japan." Dr. Bigelow's gift led to other generous donations, most notably 6,600 prints from William S. and John T. Spaulding. In 1998, I joined the staff of the Asian Conservation Studio as the first conservator dedicated to caring for flat Asian works on paper and illustrated books. This includes South Asian paintings, Islamic manuscripts, and of course, Japanese woodblock prints. As I became familiar with the collection, however, I found some areas to be in less than perfect order. Due to the size of the Japanese print collection, and because many were acquired in large quantities at the same time, the documentation and care for these works of art was a task of overwhelming proportion. For the most part, prints from the early 18th century to the first quarter of the 19th century were accessioned and counted, while prints by later artists, such as Kuniyoshi and Kunisada, were not. Here is an example of how some of the prints were stored. Please note, Please note these packages wrapped in brown paper over here at the left and the lower right. I have to say, so many exciting discoveries were made during that first year that I really, really felt like an archaeologist on a dig. It was just like one thing, oh my God, one thing, oh my God. It was amazing. And in the case of this mysterious brown paper-wrapped package, when opened, a stack of close to 150 Kunisada prints, in near pristine condition was revealed. Fortunately, the timely introduction of electronic databases for managing museum collections, digital photography, and high-quality image scanning enabled a transformational 5-year project whose goal was to accession, catalog, image, and rehouse the museum's Japanese woodblock print collection. A dedicated group made up of staff, interns, museum associates, and volunteers carried out this important work to achieve this project's goals. After each sheet was accessioned, imaged, and entered into the museum's database, they received basic rehousing that you see here within archival folders and with acid-free, not buffered cover slips. Complete rehousing, seen here, is comprised of prints hinged into museum quality window mats with a cover slip, and once the cover slip is removed, the prints are ready to be placed in a frame for exhibition. Of note regarding the Kuniyoshi Kunisada exhibition, John Robbie, our senior collection care specialist, framed the Kuniyoshi prints in black frames and the Kunisada prints in cherry wood. So that's a great way when you go through the exhibition to distinguish between both artists. After the prints were placed and located into solander boxes, they were housed in a renovated storage area within new fixtures. This collection is now widely accessible to the general public and scholars through publications, exhibitions, and the museum's website, www.mfa.org. And what's really great is you can now search through our print collection using sometimes artist name, but you can also use subject matter, and you can pretty much maneuver and find, a print that might interest you. Since Kuniyoshi and Kunisada were among the artists whose works most needed attention, the current exhibition would not have been possible before the project's completion in 2010. Of the 52,000 prints in the collection, we learned that there are 10,304 sheets by Kunisada and 3,794 sheets by Kuniyoshi. Within this group, there are a number of impressions of a single image. Having multiple impressions of a single image is a feature of the MFA's Japanese print collection that distinguishes it and makes it an invaluable resource to both scholars and collectors. Indeed, one of the great pleasures of working with this collection is the ability to compare impressions of a single image. Sarah Thompson, the curator of Japanese prints, our colleagues, and I viewed many impressions of Kuniyoshi and Kunisada prints in order to determine which ones to exhibit. We enjoyed evaluating them according to overall quality of impression, color preservation, structural integrity, and whether or not the print was an early or later edition. Applying these standards to each print helped us decide which ones could be selected for possible exhibition. For example, 2 impressions of Kunisada's print depicting the actor Bando Mitsugoro III from the series Actor Rebuses were compared in a Kunisada versus Kunisada showdown of sorts. Sometimes we refer to them as death matches. Please take a few moments to compare both impressions and note how many differences you can find. The most apparent difference between these 2 impressions is that the left sheet has an overall grayish and yellow tone when compared to this impression. The other difference is quite apparent, I hope, when you look at the pink and red tones of the rebus and the actor's makeup. The left sheet is quite faded. The left print also displays some structural damage. Losses and surface abrasions are located at the upper left, the center, and the lower left. There's also, you might be able to make it a little tear here, which is unusual damage for a Japanese print, which you'll find out later because the paper is so strong. Even though some of the condition issues that are exhibited on the left sheet could be treated and improved through conservation, these damages, especially the faded color, which can't be improved, let us agree that the right impression should be selected because it most accurately represents the artist's original intent. We considered this Kunisada pentaptych of dashing, yukata-clad actors captured as if by paparazzi, enjoying cool breezes along the Sumida River, even though it is in overall good condition and perfectly suitable for exhibition. We were thrilled to locate another impression of all 5 sheets. Sometimes we might find 3 or 2 of something like this, but all 5 sheets sharply printed with brilliant, unfaded colors in phenomenal physical condition. We couldn't believe it. It's as if it had just been purchased from the publisher. In the case of this pair of Kuniyoshi prints designed for the series 800 Japanese Heroes, the museum is fortunate to have impressions from 2 different editions. The print on the right, which was chosen for the exhibition, was published in 1830 by Kagaya Kichimon, and the image on the left was published about 15 years later in 1845 by Abaya Sensiburo. The earlier edition of the image, as you can see, has a muted and quite sophisticated palette when compared to the somewhat harsh colors used for the later edition. I want to note here that these are not faded color. This is really a great impression in the condition color-wise that it was intended. And often, darker, more assertive colors were chosen for later editions, as it has been here, in order to dazzle the eye and distract from the loss of clarity and sharpness when well-worn blocks are printed. Print enthusiasts, like myself, will spend many happy hours comparing impressions and the merits of different impressions. Which one do you prefer? Can I have a show of hands? Who likes the right one? Who likes the left one? Good, some people like the bright colors. You know what? It often just comes down to a matter of taste, and collectors would collect both editions because they each have their own merits. What is the paper used for printing Japanese prints? Many people refer to Japanese and Asian papers in general as rice paper. Actually, no such thing exists, with the exception of edible rice paper used to make the yummy Vietnamese fresh summer rolls pictured here. Although there are some Japanese and Asian papers that do contain rice straw, most papers used for traditional woodblock printing in Japan are made from the paper mulberry pictured here. There are 3 varieties, kozo, mitsumata, and gampi, each of which has its own characteristics and uses. Kozo is the variety most often used to make paper for printing. Here is a stick harvested from the plant with some of the bark peeled to obtain the white inner bark. The layers of this dark bark will be stripped from the stick after it has been steamed in order to facilitate easy and complete separation of these layers. And after drying, it is rehydrated and scraped to further remove dark bits. And after this round of drying, the bark will be boiled in an alkali bath to further weaken the plant's structure. Then it will be washed in a stream to further lighten its tone and remove remaining alkali. The most tedious part of the process pictured here, and it explains why paper makers often have hunched shoulders, is to clean the fiber to remove the minutest traces of dark bark and other impurities. The next step is to pound the mass of fiber in order to break apart the individual strands, as well as shorten, soften, and hydrate them. This step is critical to the formation of a dense, even sheet of paper. When it is ready, the resulting pulp is washed and placed into a vat with clean water and plant mucilage, much like the slime that comes out of okra. And this mucilage allows the fibers to float in the vat. And the paper maker will capture the floating fibers onto a screen to produce a sheet of paper. The stack of newly formed sheets will be pressed under weight to extract excess water, and eventually each sheet will be peeled from the stack and brushed onto a board to bleach in the sunlight. This illustration shows the torn edge of high-quality kozo paper in order to display some of its qualities. You can see it has a neutral tone and it has absorbency, which makes it an ideal support for printed color, while the long, supple fibers seen here give the paper phenomenal strength. And this innate tensile strength of the paper enables it to survive multiple printings, the pressure and deformation that is generated from the woodblock without being damaged. The colors used for printing are comprised of organic and inorganic dyes and pigments. The spectrum of reference samples illustrates some of the colors that were commonly available to printers. These colorants are obtained from a variety of sources, and the organic colorants are derived from plants or insects, and inorganic pigments come from minerals and ores, or they can be artificially produced through chemical reactions. Each pigment or colorant has its own characteristics which are used by the printer to create certain effects. For example, organic colorants are capable of producing vibrant, translucent tones, while inorganic pigments can produce deep, opaque tones. Over the past several years, working closely with the museum's research scientists, we have sought to identify the palettes used throughout the history of printmaking in Japan, using a variety of non-destructive analytical techniques. Reds have been of particular interest. Here are printed samples of the traditional reds that are well documented in the printmaking literature. From the top, where is this? From the top, safflower red, red ochre, also called Bengal red, red lead, vermilion, and sappanwood. Both the safflower and sappanwood reds are organic. They come from petals in this case and from bark in this case. And the rest are inorganic, and some can come from chemical reactions as well as being natural occurring ores and minerals. One of the prints we studied in advance of the exhibition is this image of a woman playing with a cat designed by Kuniyoshi and published between 1821 and 1823. The decorative border around the fishmonger illustrates the safflower. You can imagine our eagerness to find out if the printer actually used safflower to print its image. Wouldn't that be really awesomely cool? Comparing the image of the safflower printed and designed by Kuniyoshi, you can see how accurately this very simple rendering captures the plant. And again, it's the petals that are used to formulate the color that is printed here on our in-house printed sample. And here is the excitation emission matrix spectrum for this colorant. And the area you want to look at is the area here and here below the diagonal band. For most organic red colorants used for Japanese prints, these fluorescent patterns are unique, somewhat. Some people liken it to like how everybody has a different fingerprint. So here again is the safflower sample and its spectrum, and here is the print and its spectrum. Do they look the same? Not really. I mean, we have two sort of emission spectra here, and here it's a large amorphous spectra with not really anything below. So we had the big question to answer. What can this color be? To find the answer, we further researched the literature on red colorants used for printmaking, including those used to dye textiles. This research led us to investigate a likely source for our unknown red. Could this color be madder, which is an organic red that was frequently used as a textile dye? Thanks to the generosity of Japanese colleagues, we were able to obtain Japanese madder roots, which are the dye's source, formulate the color, and print it. And then we saw that its spectra was similar to that one used for the unknown Kuniyoshi print. Although madder is rarely mentioned as a colorant used for printing, its use could have had a practical economic impact on the commercial production of prints. Since prints were popular imagery designed for mass consumption, using madder instead of the more expensive safflower, could have helped publishers maintain low production costs in order to keep prints affordable. As we continued our work to survey the reds used for printmaking, we are detecting recurrent use of madder as part of the printer's palette. And why madder was used here and for the figure's clothing and the cat's collar, we did happen to find a whisper of safflower across the subject's eyes. And I encourage you, when you go to look at the exhibition, to find this print, and you can barely see it. And in this case, and in many cases, it's used sparingly by the printer. And in one of the documents we read by someone who documented printmaking in the early 20th century, she said that safflower is like gold. A printer will use it as sparingly as they will spend their money. So it gives us a sense of how precious that particular pink color was. Traditional woodblock print production employs the talents of the publisher, artist, block cutter, and printer. At the center is the publisher, who coordinates all aspects of production and marketing. To start, an artist would be commissioned to design a print or a series of prints. A completed drawing with both colors and textures specified would be taken to block cutters, and blocks for each color would be printed. In the hands of the printer, color would be applied and paper impressed onto the block surface. For a full color print, a minimum of 10 printings were needed to bring an image to completion. Prints with special added effects, such as mica, embossing, burnishing, or spattered color, employed additional blocks or stencils. About 200 prints of a single image could be completed within a day. The completed prints would then enter the marketplace, sold by the publisher, either at his own shop, as depicted by this Utamaro print, or by traveling salesmen or street vendors, as seen in this 1890s Meiji-era print. Let's review now how a print is made. This Adachi press reproduction of a simple 3-color print plus black will illustrate the process used to make a print. First, the artist's drawing is pasted face down onto a cherry wood block. The image will be carved onto the block in reverse. So when it is printed, the image will look exactly like the original drawing. You can see here that the block is carved to reproduce each detail of the original drawing. Registration marks, highlighted here, are called the kento, and they are indicated on the side and lower corner of the drawing, and then when carved into the block, these marks serve to consistently guide the paper's placement during printing and really help the printer keep each color in perfect alignment to one another as they are added to the image. The drawing that was used as a guide, again, is destroyed when carving is completed. However, a reproduction of the drawing is created when paper is printed using the key block. The image printed from the key block reproduces the drawing in the same direction it was made. You can see here, we can go back and forth. And unfortunately, that was like my little tracing drawing because they didn't supply us with the drawing for this reproduction. Several impressions will be pulled from the key block, and like the original drawing, these prints will be pasted face down onto other blocks to guide the block carver. Acting as a template for carving, this simple black print, seen here, will be used to generate each color block as it gets carved in order to fashion a full color image. Each color will be transferred to the paper from light to dark, traditionally ending with blue. In the sequence you will soon see, I have included a print of the color from each block to clearly illustrate the area of color that is added to build the image, starting with yellow, and then adding red. And again, those color fields that have no lines, it's just to show you what that area looks like printed, but it's never printed alone. It's always added to the image as we go along. And then finally, the blue. And here is the completed image. Secondary colors can be made by overprinting. And you can see here the green tone on Mount Fuji is made through overprinting blue onto yellow. And this really does sometimes is used to save the block cutter from having to create a separate block for green. So an assortment of brushes are used by the printer, from these larger brushes for applying color to broad areas on the block, to these shoe polishing looking brushes, which are used to draw color from the top down the block into ever paler colors. And then these little brushes that look like witches' brooms are made by the printer as they go along from spent bamboo sheath. And these are used to flick color onto the block and also add little bits of paste and water to adjust the dilutions of the color. Printers will often have a chisel and a spare piece of wood in case there's a defect in the block or breakage so they can repair it. But the most important tool the printer uses is the baron. Pictured here, it's a disc of lacquered paper. On the inside is a coil, much like a very thin braid. It can be made out of paper or bamboo sheath that's recycled from the cover of the baron, which is made out of a bamboo sheath. Here is a view of the printer at work. Please note how efficiently the work area is arranged so everything is within easy reach. Let's see now how the printer uses these relatively simple tools to create a print. Color is applied to the block, and the printer will regulate the amount of color and how it's applied. This will contribute to the print's final appearance. The consistency and intensity of each coloring can be modified by adding variable amounts of diluted starch paste or water onto the block. And you can see here he's getting ready to pop some starch paste on the block. Paper that is prepared for printing with an alum and animal glue size called dosa is pre-moistened, put in a plastic envelope, and now it's being retrieved. I want you to note that there is a print, a reference print on top of this package, and it's the print that is in progress. So it's not the completed print, but a print that may have some colors yet to be added, and that helps the printer keep track of where they're going and where they are. The paper will then be carefully placed over the block using the registration marks, or the kento, as a guide to ensure correct alignment. And then, using the baron, the printer exerts pressure over the paper so it will absorb the color. Variations in tone and special effects will emerge under the expert hands of a master printer. After the color is transferred to the paper, the printer will inspect his work to ensure that the color has been applied in proper registration and according to plan. So you can see here, maybe the purple color has been added, but the green and other tones are yet to be added to the print. So you can see, he can see where he's going and where he's been. To review, how color is applied to the block and manipulated in combination with the direction and orientation and pressure exerted on the baron during printing will reveal the printer's artistry. Kuniyoshi and Kunisada were masterful designers of popular imagery that celebrated the world of kabuki, beautiful women, humor, and scenes from history and myth. A closer look at a selection of their works displays not only their talents, but those of artisan block cutters and printers who work to transform their designs into prints that are enlivened by stunning special effects. The background of this vibrant triptych reveals variations in movement and pressure exerted on the baron by the printer. Traces of movement are seen in this upper area. And here's a closer look. And I hope you can see these strokes and lines. They're not defects in printing, they're part of the character of the printing. And one of the favorite things I get to do is see the prints from the reverse. And here you can really see the pressure exerted on the prints back by the printer. And I don't know about you, but for me, it's like I have this sort of chills down my spine because it's like I'm there back then, experience some intentional movement that took place long ago. I really get a thrill out of this part of working with prints. Expert color preparation to create a variety of shades requires remarkable skill. The color blue in several dilutions was used to print this monochromatic image. I think the depth and range of tones displayed here are comparable to those found on fine black and white photographs. Initially imported from the West and formulated in the chemist's laboratory, the inorganic blue pigment used here, known as Prussian blue, is a ferric ferrocyanide compound. And when introduced into the printer's palette by the 1830s, blueprints such as this one created a sensation, and for a few years there was like a craze. Many people were designing blueprints, most notably Hokusai and the series of Fuji and the Great Wave. We all think of that blue, and that's this blue. I have to say these prints can be seen to celebrate the variety of tones this exotic and recently available color was capable of producing. So check it out in the gallery, look at all 5 sheets, and just see how you may forget that it's just blue. I often look at it and I almost see the colors because the values are so well rendered. Thinly applied tones can lend drama, transparency, and visual dimension to an image. Here, thinly applied color reproduces the dramatic effect of a spotlight, but it can also depict the dissolution of a human into a fox. And the transparent blues printed here, when block and print paper meet, convincingly place the figure above and below water. Another technique produced during printing is graduated tone, and in Japanese it's called bokashi. This effect is produced by placing saturated color on the block where the deepest intensity is desired and diluting it to create a range of ever paler tones as it is wiped across the block. So you remember those shoe brush type of brushes? Well, the printer will use the little witch's broom to throw some dark color, and then with that shoe brush, work the color down into the print. You can see a really nice version of that here and here. But in this case, it's sometimes used just as a little line to frame the image and maybe denote sky or ground. In this Surimono print, a master printer employed the technique of graduated tone or bokashi to create a field of colorful clouds. It can also be used to create the effect of a stormy ocean's violent waves. And finally, one of my favorite prints in this show is the dizzying psychedelic effect created by carved blocks combined with graduated tone or bokashi is a device that will effectively attract attention. When you go through the exhibition, try to see how many examples of this technique you can find. Mica printing makes use of a luminescent inorganic mineral pigment. Mica most often is applied to paper with the aid of a stencil, using a technique much like sprinkling powdered sugar onto the surface of a cake. Use of this sparkling pigment in this case acts to highlight the figure as if he is spotlit on stage. And this detail of the area above the figure's head shows how mica's granular structure sometimes makes it susceptible to loss and abrasion. So it's very rare to find a print where the mica has not been disturbed. And we have a couple from this series in the exhibition, and make a note of, like, is it in good condition? Is there a little bit of damage? It's another thing to look for when you look at a print. High-quality prints, such as Surimono, often make use of metallic pigments, and rather than real gold and silver, brass and tin are often the materials used to add bling to these luxurious limited edition Surimono prints. And again, when you look at them in the gallery, move your head a little bit and you'll see like amazing sparkle and also some textures. Wood grain textures, you can see used down below on this Kuniyoshi print, are often the result of the addition of a strip of highly grained wood to the end of a cherry wood block. And the use of wood grain on this particular print really reinforces the effect of a storehouse wall or architecture. There's often very strong intent to how these special effects are used, and so when you notice them, try to think of why it was used and how it makes the image richer or more enticing or somewhat approximating reality. Embossing, seen here, or three-dimensional convex textures are produced when moist paper is pressed into concave cuts into the block. The intimate relationship between the block and paper seen here employs the skills of both the block cutter and printer in order to recreate the puffy appearance of blossoms. Burnishing is another technique that showcases a unity of skills, those of the printer and the carver. Executed at the end of printing process, when the print is dry, the print is positioned face up upon a wood block. The printer will then carefully rub its surface with a hard, smooth object, such as a teacup. The carved pattern from the block below will emerge as a shiny pattern. And this special effect is often very difficult to see. It appears in dark areas, and you really have to take your time looking. It's sort of like one of those special effect movies with so many explosions. They're like throwaways. Well, this is a stealthy, somewhat throwaway special effect. But a hidden pattern will be revealed to the patient viewer. And if you look at the print at just the right angle, can you see the pattern here? It's sort of a key pattern, and it's just created by the shiny and the matte areas as they relate. To catch this effect in any exhibition, you'll have to move your head from side to side and your body up and down. And I often refer to this as the print connoisseur's dance. So if you see people looking like they're having a seizure, they may just be trying to see some surface effects on a print. Spattered pigment, in this case white lead, appears across the print surface. And this is a case where the bristles of that witch's broom brush were loaded with pigment and flicked over the print to emulate droplets and splashes of foam. And then finally, sometimes the appearance of a pigment is chemically altered in order to distinguish certain elements of a design. And in this case, after all the colors were applied, areas of red lead pigment were printed or brushed over with a weak vinegar solution and placed into a cabinet with rotten eggs. And here is a detail of that sort of black tarnish patination over the red lead. The chemical reaction between the vinegar and sulfur generated from rotten eggs will cause this pigment to darken. And in this image, I'll go back to it, the tone of darkened lead pigment can be seen to distinguish what is imagined from what is real, with the exception of the spotted cat. Anyway, I hope this closer look at techniques helps you understand the role artisan block cutters and printers played as interpreters of an artist's design. Even though these prints were intended as mass-produced commodities, each impression really is unique and has its own unique qualities that, for me, really embody the temperament and talents of the printer and, in a sense, are an expression of the print's soul. How do Kuniyoshi and Kunisada differ? This is a total personal take on it. Comparison of these two ghostly images of actors, Kuniyoshi's on the left and Kunisada's on the right, illuminates some of the differences. Shown from a distance, Kuniyoshi's figure emerges from a mist of graduated tone. Kunisada's closer view sets the figure in a rainy landscape or stage setting. Transparent and lacking in substance, Kuniyoshi's actor is conceived of as an actual ghost. In contrast, Kunisada depicts the actor made up to appear as a ghost. A closer look at each image clarifies this point. On Kuniyoshi's print, you can see, again, can we find, the pale blue depicts the rib cage and sinews of muscle on the arms, and I apologize, you'll have to go and look at the print in the gallery. There's a sort of a dusting of blue pigment printed on the arms and the face of this figure, just as if an actor would be made up to appear as a ghost on stage. I feel that Kuniyoshi's image is very artistic, whereas Kunisada has a bold graphic take on the same subject. Formats are another way that these two artists differ. The vertical or horizontal oban format seen here was the standard in the world of printing. As they began to do public color prints, they realized that there was a very efficient size of paper and block to use, and this is the size that they came up with. And it's called the oban, and it can be vertical or horizontal, depending on the composition. Individual oban-sized prints or sheets could be combined to expand an image's design as exemplified by this triptych. So any of the large images you see are all made up of that incremental piece. And sometimes I think of like artists like Chuck Close, who use small little fields and combine them to make a bigger image. That's really similar to what's going on here. Both Kuniyoshi and Kunisada excelled at designing the single oban and oban triptych format images. But Kunisada, with the support of a willing publisher, published and pushed these formats well beyond the commonly used standards to achieve awe-inspiring proportions. Taking one horizontal oban triptych and adding another below it expands this image and gives the viewer a heightened impression of space, one that can be virtually walked into. And as you view the exhibition, locate other unusual formats used for Kunisada's prints and see if they're successful or they're just splashy. How were the prints used during their time? As inexpensive consumer items, prints were somewhat ephemeral. They were pasted onto walls, as seen here. Also, they could be pasted onto screens as further decoration. And some were collected and preserved, either in portfolios. And, you know, before TV, wouldn't you want to get your group of prints out and relive some plays and stories from history and check out the fashions the latest beauty is wearing? They could also be pasted into albums, such as this one from our collection. And then from time to time, they could also be pasted end to end, as these prints are. And it's a quite witty image. The actors are looking for their depictions in these prints, and they might be saying, well, I don't look so good here, or you look better, or whatever. So I'd like to conclude by showing you an example of a typical conservation treatment that was undertaken to prepare a work for exhibition. This Kuniyoshi print displays insect loss to its support, localized soiling here, and some stains. To improve the appearance of this print, it was gently surface cleaned to reduce surface and ingrained soil, And this step was followed by stain reduction using filtered water and pH-adjusted water. The last step of the treatment involved filling losses with a suitable Japanese paper and in-painting the fills to approximate the original color. Here is the work after treatment as it now appears in the exhibition. I really want to thank you all for being here today and enduring the long lecture. And I really did enjoy sharing my work with our wonderful collection with you. And if you wish, after this program is completed, I will be in the gallery, and I invite you to come, and I can show you some of the special effects in real life. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to field any questions, or you're certainly welcome to ask me in the gallery.
Thank you so much. When the artist draws the image, does the artist also paint the color in that he wants to have the printer print?
That's a super question. We don't have many remaining preliminary drawings that indicate color or texture notations. And there will be one drawing made, but that will be traced. So there must have been something more with more notations for the colors made, or maybe it was made in communication with the publisher, and maybe the publisher sort of decided how much money they were going to spend on how elaborate it would be. Those things are somewhat ambiguous in the process. Thank you. Was there another question?
I have a question about paper.
Yes.
Is the standard Oban paper size used for other things besides printmaking, books, or do you suppose they just chose an available size of paper?
Each sheet is made to a certain overall dimension, and it's divided up Oban, and then there are smaller sheet sizes used for prints, Chuban, which is like half of an Oban. And then books have very specific formats too. So everything is pretty regularized according to the size sheet that the paper maker makes, and then that sheet is divided accordingly to its use.
I guess my question has to do with whether you think the printmaker, the print trade, adopted an existing paper size because it was handy or something.
It was a size that was created by splitting up a larger size. Very rarely would paper makers just make an Oban size sheet. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Yes?
It seems that there, through the time period of prints, there was a change in the coloration.
Yes. Yes, that example I showed you of Kiyomitsu. As printmaking develops, first it's just black line and color is added by hand, sometimes with stencils. And then that kento someone figures that out, and the first steps are printing 2 to 3 colors, and then the big breakthrough takes place around 1765 with Harinobu, and you get a full-color print.
And during the Meiji period, wasn't there they were more brilliant colors?
Yes.
Did that use some chemical reaction to create?
So early on, some mineral and organic colorants are used that are much like dye stuffs. And then around the 1830s, the introduction into the palette of Prussian blue, which was an import, and it was used before that for paintings, but it was really too expensive to be used for making commercial items like prints. So once that color started to be formulated in Asia by the Chinese, it was available for use in prints. So that's when you get this great outpouring. of colors. And then in the Meiji period, the introduction of aniline dyes, which are a coal tar dye, come in, and those colors are often associated by most print connoisseurs as, denoting cheaper later prints, very decadent. But to me, they all have their place and their role in the history of printmaking. Yes?
How many prints would you get from a single block, or does a block never wear out?
Super question. The block would wear, and in the case of that Kuniyoshi print of the 800 warriors, we had 2 different editions, and the block will start to smash a little from pressure and from being wet and so forth. And sometimes blocks are recarved, and there was a market in blocks. So sort of a higher end publisher, if an image was really popular, the block could be sold to another publisher who would do another edition, and sometimes a few things would change, like a head could be plugged in, maybe with a newer hairstyle to reflect the current fashion. So there are all sorts of things that happen in a history of a block. In this exhibition, we have some limited edition or special edition prints, surimono prints, and often they have poems associated with them. Well, often they were just such gorgeous, beautiful works that they would be reissued without the poems, and maybe on occasion with a different poem. So again, the object here is they are creating what we see as beautiful works of art, but they're also, you have to remember, it's commercial art. They're sort of like rock posters and baseball cards and things that are ephemera to us today, and they were somewhat that way back then. And those of you who were at Sarah's lecture last week, they cost probably something like a Happy Meal or a Big Mac. They were affordable to most people. Any other questions?
It seemed that the manufacture of the paper itself
Yes.
was very time-consuming, and I wondered, are they still able to find people to manufacture the paper in that way?
Yes, there are several paper-making villages, and one of them is north of Kyoto called Kurudani, and when I was a graduate student, I was lucky enough to visit, and I got to see how intensely how much labor went into it, and sort of how the paper makers really do suffer, because you're bending over and often your hands are in cold water picking all day. And at the time, this was in the 80s, a lot of paper makers were walking and they were bent over at their waist. There are not maybe as many people doing paper making, but traditionally it was a activity that was undertaken by farmers during the winter months, because in order to make really good paper, you don't want the fiber to mold up and the pulp to get too stinky, so the cold weather of the winter made it very suitable. And there's a folk saying that, oh, to be a paper maker's wife, it was sort of like really, really, really bad. Yes?
How are the publishers able to distribute the product? Did it go through shops or
Yes,
sold on the street?
in that Utamaro print, they had their own shops, and they would sell loose prints, sometimes prints pasted into albums, and also prints pasted onto paper mounts, so they looked like hanging scrolls, but of course they would be inexpensive. So they had their shops. They would also had a distribution system much like book publishing today, where other venues would sell them, and they also had, I think you saw that slide of the man with the box selling prints from street to street. So there was a fairly sophisticated distribution network for the commercial prints.
Could you say a little bit more about your comment on the two impressions of the Kuniyoshi print? That one that looked faded really wasn't faded, it was the color that was intended. How did you determine that?
How did I determine that? Being familiar with other impressions and knowing that was the palette that was intended, and also the balance of the tones. Some of it has to do with experience, but it's a great question. Okay, so it's often by experience working with them and understanding the balance of the colors, and this may have very, very slight fading to the reds, sort of like what you see here, but like if you look at the balance of this print, that's really faded. And the other print, it's all like in its range of palette. Another way I can tell if the color has been off is if the print had been lined. Often the colors are very water soluble, and with a paste lining, the colors will go through the back. And then another way to tell if a print is faded or not is to look at the back, and the color will survive on the back much more closely. And in this case, it was pretty consistent throughout. And then again, looking at other impressions and other collections from this edition led us to realize we had a really good thing. Yes?
Would you consider then these are from different editions?
Yes, yes.
Could they be from the same publisher or different?
They were different publishers. One is Abaya. Over here is a later edition from a different publisher in about 15 years later from this one.
Is there substantial information on different editions of the same print by different publishers?
Yeah, pretty much with researchers, and sometimes there will be notations on the print that let you know that that's the case. So if you look up here, you can see there's a little bit of a difference in the characters. But again, I'm a lowly conservator and I'm not a curator. But there are differences that one can see. And sometimes there's physical evidence that we have to go on just by looking under magnification at a print. And in the case comparing these two, let's see. If you look at the lines here on the arm, they seem somewhat more sharper, and these are broader. So that's another sort of clue. And if you're a collector, it pays to look at a lot of prints, and that's why it's so fantastic that we have our collection online, because people are really beginning to use it to compare what we have with something they might see in the marketplace. Yes?
Is there any suspicion that the one impression on the left was from a block that was recut?
Often there is some recutting in another edition. We have this fantastic Utamaro print in the collection of a beauty in this great pink robe, and she's basically a fashion plate. And we have one edition, and her hair is one style, and we have a later edition, and they plugged in her head, and she has like whatever the current hairdo was at the time. So that happened a lot. They weren't really like sacrosanct in that sense. They were, if they could be sold, if it was popular, it was sold until it just was no longer, popular or marketable.
There's one more all the way in the back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit of the writing on all the prints? There's probably the handko of the artist and...
Yes, so there's sort of a schema that's used. So on this print, for example, this is the subject, and then you might have information further related to that. Here is the artist's name, and here's a little more information about the story. So let's go back. So here on this Kunisada print, you can see here are some censor marks, and here's the artist's name, and here's the series, and it may even tell you who the actor is. Okay? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you for
Thank
coming
you,
today.
everybody.